Okay, Siddharth Shrikanth, thank you so much for your time today and welcome to our India at Harvard author series. Anirudh and I are really happy to have you here. You've written such an important book and such a timely book about the importance of preserving our nature, preserving biodiversity, preserving our local ecosystems as we move forward in our economic targets globally. So this is a very, very important book, and it's particularly really exciting for us to have you here, given that G20 has just ended. This community that we are airing this talk for is, of course, India specific. So today we'll ask you about your book, your journey, a little bit about your main thoughts, your key points from the book, but also your, your desires, your expectations from G20. And your hopes of what you're seeing in terms of pacts and bills and policies going forward. So thank you for being here, and thank you to all our listeners who are joining in. Anirudh?
So Siddharth, I was hoping that what we can do to start us off is to ask you about why this book, why now, right? And what inspired you to write this book at this time and on this topic?
Brilliant. So I think for me, and I've been in the nature and climate space for over a decade now, and I think part of what I was reflecting on, I'm a conservation biologist by training, and so the first part of my career I spent working on conservation and nature, and to me it was very clear that intrinsically this was the right thing to do. Right, we have a biodiversity crisis that is just as urgent as the climate crisis, and I assume most people agree. And then as I went out into the world and worked on climate action specifically, what became very clear to me is we've done, we're way off track, both with India's climate targets and global climate targets, but, and this is an important but, there's significant public recognition of the fact that we have to cut carbon emissions. And that recognition has really spurred policy, large corporate commitments from most sectors of the economy, and just general awareness that climate action is important. With the biodiversity crisis, we're still stuck in this 20th century paradigm of conservation. And let me describe it to you. What it really is a sense that nature is important. We kind of intrinsically have a love for nature, but we see it as somehow outside of the modern market economy. We see it as a nice to have, versus climate action, where we're seeing real businesses being built, real economic models being pursued, and this being seen as fundamental to economic growth. And so for me, the why nature, why now? The why now is very clear. The biodiversity crisis is accelerating. We're in the middle of a sixth mass extinction. As human beings, we rely on a healthy ecology to sustain everything. Just life on Earth would not exist if it didn't, if we weren't part of a functioning ecosystem. But why nature is just because I was inspired by some of the work we've done in the climate crisis. We need to do the same thing to elevate the nature crisis, to make the same sorts of arguments and lay them on top of the intrinsic arguments. Because if we don't do that, I think we end up leaving nature by the wayside as we pursue our climate goals.
Siddharth, your journey to getting here, what about your different experiences educationally and professionally that led you to write this book, and also some of the insights that you share? Walk our listeners through some of those experiences with different stakeholders and companies.
Yeah, happy to do that. So as I mentioned, I studied conservation biology at Oxford. The first part of my kind of academic career was spent studying ecosystems and just learning how biology works. And I absolutely loved it. But my first job out of university, I almost did a PhD, but in the end ended up not choosing an academic path and joined McKinsey & Company here in London. But the first bit of my career was essentially serving large corporates as they began to think about their sustainability goals. This was, pretty much a decade ago, and you saw the beginnings of climate action and commitments and interest, significantly less credible than they are today. But that first piece made me realize that there is a real appetite to at least think through some of the challenges and some of the opportunities with climate. So I did that for a couple of years based in London. I then moved to Indonesia to set up an entity called McKinsey.org. Think of it basically as a social impact incubator for new ideas. We pursued a specific idea and concept around ending plastic pollution in the oceans, which at the time in 2017-18 was a really important, top of mind issue. It's part of the biodiversity crisis. It's linked, but it's separate. And so I moved to Bali, which is an amazing place. It's obviously a stunning place to live, but it's also got a horrible plastic pollution problem. What you don't see when you go on holiday to Bali is this enormous underbelly where a huge amount of plastic ends up in the ocean, often from tourist hotels and resorts and things like that. And so we ended up looking across the whole value chain of plastic pollution, starting from the source, so separating waste at the source, and then getting it through to sorting, recycling, and markets. So I worked with everyone from local communities in Indonesian, which I learned. It's a surprisingly easy language to learn, all the way through to big companies like Unilever and Nestle and Danone, to work out how we could tackle that problem. In some ways, it's a really contained problem, and even that was really hard to set up and run. That organization is now spun out into a separate entity called Delterra. They operate in multiple countries now, but it was a really important experience for me in setting up and leading that organization for a while and making that happen. I've taken a bit of a winding path. So then the love of writing began. I've always loved to write. I wanted to pursue that and just get better at it. And so I ended up moving to Hong Kong to be a journalist at the Financial Times. And that was a classic foreign correspondent role. I wrote about markets and politics during the day, did a bunch of long pieces, often on environmental topics in my afternoons, and just really began to love the art of writing, and really loved it, and learned a lot from people much cleverer than me. And that, I think, was where the seed of the idea to start to write this book began. So I started off there. I then actually ended up going to Harvard for the public policy master's and Stanford for my MBA. So it was a dual degree. And those 3 years were amazing years where I got to explore a number of different climate and nature related things along the way. So I did some work for the World Bank. I set up a company that does agricultural carbon removal, so putting trees in pasture land in the US Southeast and measuring that carbon using technology. So I learned some of the real challenges of working on the ground. And I also had lots of time to research and write this book. And so I began researching it, ended up exploring lots of different ways to publish. I made the final 3 of a prize called the Bracken Bauer Prize, which is a prize for authors thinking about writing a book who only have a proposal. And so I did that. Funnily enough, the FD and McKinsey ran that prize. And so I don't think there's any link to my former employers, but it was an amazing opportunity to learn how the process actually works. And that then led to a publishing contract. I spent about 1.5 years researching and then writing it. It came out in May this year. So it takes a long time for these things to actually come up. But the idea was always there, this kind of feeling that this topic deserved some kind of generalist, almost journalistic treatment, because the ideas in the book are not mine. What I've done, and I'm very explicit about that, what I've done is told those stories in a way that generalist readers can pick up and enjoy reading, because lots of these books tend to be textbooks, amazing pieces of work, but just books that I would read, but I wouldn't expect everyone else in my life to read. So that's how it all began.
So that's really great to hear, sort of the path and journey that took you there. And post writing the book and launching the book, how have you seen the conversation change across the various stakeholders? Because we've seen really vibrant conversations of you with newspapers to media to different academic institutions. So take us into the world of some of these stakeholders, right? And what they're asking you, what they're thinking about, government to private sector to academia.
Yeah. It's a great, and I should also mention my current day job. I'm an investor in climate and nature solutions. So I work with a firm called Generation Investment Management, which Vice President Al Gore set up about 20 years ago with a number of founding partners. I'm part of the Just Climate team, which is focused on really hard to abate sectors of the economy, including nature. And so I engage with these ideas on a day-to-day basis. So it's partly the book and partly my day job. I get to speak to lots of different people and learn what's on their mind. There's a couple of things that come up consistently, certainly on the book side of things. One is a sense of, oh my gosh, I had no idea these things even existed. So I think the the real failure of our communication over the last decade or so has been that we haven't done a good job of telling the stories. And I have a bunch of stories in the book because I go all over the world. And to give you a flavor of these examples, I go to Colombia to look at a mangrove carbon project, to Fiji to look at an ecotourism initiative that really works, Palau to look at how they ended overfishing, Kenya to look at how they're empowering indigenous people with technology, California to figure out how finance is helping tackle wildfires. So lots of different amazing examples, but my main reaction, one of the main reactions has been just surprise. And I'm not surprised because I think we haven't told these stories. So that's one that I keep hearing over and over again. The other is a sense of, oh my gosh, really, I've been working on climate now. Do I really have to add another problem to my set of a very long list of problems that includes, global geopolitical insecurity, inflation, and various other things. And so what I say to that second challenge is two things. One, nature can be a really powerful ally in tackling climate change. I mean, India, just to bring it back to India, the government has set a target of creating new carbon sinks of between 2.5 and 3 gigatons. That's 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon by the year 2030. We're not on track to achieve that. And really the only feasible way for India to do that is to harness our forests and our soils, agricultural soils. And so meeting climate targets really fundamentally involves reshaping our relationship to nature and protecting and restoring it. So that's one. I'd say can be a low-cost, efficient way to do that while empowering communities and protecting biodiversity. So that's why you should care. But the other reason I often cite is, and I have this line in the book, the case for tackling climate change on its own is the case for ensuring human survival, right? But the case for nature, in my mind, is the complementary case for securing a living planet that's actually worth living for. And in my mind, that's what this is about. It's about actually creating a planet that we want to be on and that we actually enjoy being on and can live healthy, fulfilled lives. And it's just as important to do that as it is to reduce the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, which is fundamental as well.
That's great. Go ahead, Anirudh.
I was just going to ask you, I think, Siddharth, the way you're articulating this, right, even for a country like India, what I find very interesting and notable is that you're not seeing any trade-off necessarily between economic growth and development and climate action, which is typically the trade-off that most, especially developing countries or non-industrialized nations, tend to harp on, right? And it's the basic assumption that they start with. So tell us how, in your head at least, do you see that not being a trade-off, and how some people who do think of it as a trade-off might be getting some assumptions wrong?
And Siddharth, before you answer, I mean, it is true what Anirudh is saying. I mean, 5 years ago, we were still talking about that trade-off, right? Which is India is an ambitious country still. It has a long road ahead, right, for industrialization, and it shouldn't have to compromise on that, at least not yet, right, in its economic journey and roadmap. So do you think, as Anirudh is asking, I mean, in your mind, how is that possible? What is the roadmap? And do you see that conversation changing in India currently, especially around G20 as well?
Yeah, so I'll take them in turn. I think one, so in the book, I don't kind of make the claim that there are no trade-offs in life. There absolutely are, right? But I think the main thrust of my argument is, in a surprising number of cases, there is no trade-off. And we should seize those opportunities with both hands and actually make them work. And so let me give you some, I mean, there's lots of examples in the book. But the other thing I just want to mention is that maybe, I think lumping all developing countries into one blob doesn't make sense, right? So I do visit Fiji where, there is a great example of them not trading off nature and economic growth. They've built an economy that has nature positive tourism at the heart of it, which is really interesting because they have achieved significant economic gains from that. But really what Fiji does on climate doesn't impact the global climate, right? It's just not a big and relevant country from a carbon emissions perspective. A country like India, actually is a meaningful share of global carbon emissions, the third largest emitter in the world. And so what India does on climate actually changes the global climate. And so in that sense, I think that argument doesn't hold in the same way that it does for lots of smaller countries. So I would first kind of flag that really for India, I think the consequences are very real. The second piece I just want to really highlight is we can't go on like this because the way climate change is here. It's happening right now. You're seeing it across the world. This year has been really horrific for wildfires, droughts, floods. We're seeing them in India as well right now. That's going to continue and accelerate over time. And so it's no longer, maybe 50 years ago, we could have had the conversation about maybe we'll develop really quickly using oil and gas and various other things and then get to green growth or a better future. That's not possible now because climate change is here. And what I kind of cite in this book is lots of cases where nature can help not just mitigate climate change, which is reduce the impacts of climate change, but actually help us adapt to climate change through things like flood resilience, soil resilience, so we can continue to feed 1.4 billion people and make cities more livable in a world that is hotter and just much harder to live in. And so there, I absolutely don't see a trade-off. I see nature as a really powerful antidote to some of the climate impacts we're seeing in India today. And so both those things can happen in parallel. I think for your question, Priyanka, I think the G20 conversation has been really interesting. Just I've been following it, and it's very clear from certainly as an observer that India is quite willing to take on a leadership role. I think that's a good thing that should be celebrated despite many of the challenges. And I think there is a chance, and kind of certainly a unique historic chance to lead on climate and nature as well, in a way that India currently is not. And we can just be clear about that. I think if you look at Climate Action Tracker, India, like most countries, to be fair, is currently critically insufficient on climate goals, despite some of the progress. And I think we should celebrate the progress where it's happened, right? For example, with solar and wind, we've seen tremendous progress in India for the last few years, partly because that economic case is now really clear and is being rolled out across the country, attracting institutional capital. It's working really well. But there are, as you say rightly, there is a huge industrial base that needs to decarbonize, and those companies will need help. I think there's also just the fact of the agriculture sector, which is enormous and employs a third of Indians and does need to transition, not just for climate reasons, but simply to continue farming in a land that is increasingly inhospitable to farming. And so I do think showing more leadership, certainly in a moment where there's global leadership and a voice like there is right now, is super interesting and presents an opportunity. The other piece of conversation I've been following is just the piece around climate finance. This is an old debate. It's been going on since the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, where rightly, I think, in my opinion, developing countries have been saying, we would love to decarbonize and save nature, but we need the money to do it. And historical emitters, please pay up. I think it's a very fair argument. But the latest number that came out out of the leaders' declaration 2 days ago was 34 trillion in aggregate finance from the global north to the global south by 2030, which is 5% of global GDP. We haven't found 100 billion over 10 years of negotiation. So in my opinion, this money isn't coming. It's a perfectly good thing to put it out there. I think it's a reasonable ask to make. I have absolutely no hope this money is going to flow just out of the goodness of the hearts of the people in the West. So India will have to find a way, I think, to finance this transition using the same tools that have helped finance the solar and wind revolution. And that includes building real economic businesses and economic cases that work, that can then attract private capital on its own merits with the right government policies in place and subsidies and so on. But I don't think kind of waiting for Western countries to pay up is a viable strategy in 2023.
No, that's right. I think that's absolutely right. So that I think there is little hope of the 34 trillion or anything close to that number coming. We're talking wrong magnitude, right, in the first place. Yeah. We're talking if billions will get transferred from the global north to the global south, not trillions. I agree with you, practically speaking. And then I also agree with your point. I think that India has to figure out its own way. Now, when you mention solar and wind, as you rightly pointed out, the economics of solar and wind, when they worked out, that's when adoption really took off in India.
Yeah.
If you step back to why the economics worked out, that at least my understanding is, and I'd love to ask you your perspective on this also, is that technology was developed outside of India. Let's say, let's take the case of solar. There's a certain amount of scale that it picks up. Large producing companies like China, in this case for solar, bring the cost of those solar cells and panels down. That actually allows a country like India to make the real economic case for then private equity firms to come in and support large solar plants, right? Now, those businesses in India, which have built out these large solar plants that are behind the fact that we've achieved, I would say, quite a impressive position on solar adoption, but not where we necessarily want to be, but still impressive, has largely been driven by this lower cost, private equity capital coming in. But then the businesses that are running this are largely today commoditized businesses as a result, because they never got the technology in the first place, and they're largely just delivery players or installation players at the end of the day. So now, if that understanding of mine is correct and is in line with how you also see it, then the question becomes, for anything else that India needs to develop on or push its adoption on, you necessarily need for the technology to be either developed either within India or outside, for its cost to come down so that adoption can happen. But now the moment you start looking at certain other subsectors of climate technology, you find that often the technology is not necessarily at that place. Is that correct, or do you have a different view on it?
I mean, I think you're totally right. I think we will need technologies to develop and come down the cost curve and scale, particularly in countries that can afford to pay the green premium first, before they can be widely rolled out in places like India. At Just Climate, we do a lot of that, so we actually help do that, help meet that capital gap for technologies that are what we think are at the commercial tipping point, but haven't attracted infrastructure capital yet. So it's really top of mind. I think that's fine. So there are lots of sectors, I would say cement and steel, for example, where there are solutions being developed. They're still fairly early, and we're seeing the first commercial deployments of green cement and green steel today in places like Europe. At that point, I think it's fine for India to wait a year or two for those technologies to be proven elsewhere before they're adopted. It's a very fair playbook, and I think it works. But I do also think
it will not just be proven, right, Siddharth? For it to be not just proven, but for the cost to actually work for a country like India and for the companies that are operating in, whether it's steel, cement, or those sectors in India. So both the technology piece, but also the affordability of the technology piece has to work, which will not take necessarily 1 year. In the case of solar, it took many years.
No, I think that's right. It's both cost and technology readiness. The thing I will say about certain technologies is them being applied, and I think this is a huge failing of global capital markets, but technologies in the global south, when they're developed elsewhere but are deployed, can actually be done at lower cost because everything is cheaper, right? Labor is cheaper, permitting isn't an issue. If you look at the biggest cost driver for high cost industrial climate solutions is the cost of capital, which is too high still, right? Because a lot of these other costs are much lower in India. And you can imagine a world where green steel in India ends up being significantly cheaper than green steel in Sweden, where the first plant is being built. But the reason it's being built in Sweden is there is sufficient finance and sufficient regulatory certainty and so on for that to be done. There's no fundamental reason why it can't be done in India, right? And I'm not saying that means it's adopted at scale in every steel plant in India, but I think where we are with each technology, there's a kind of there's lab R&D, then you start getting into early commercial deployments, then you get into scale. There are lots of early commercial deployments going on, and there's no reason why India shouldn't have at least some early commercial deployments to prove that it works. So I don't expect this to just roll out at scale immediately, but certainly India can do more to track some of those early commercial deployments in things like hydrogen, green steel, green cement, and so on. On the nature side, which is what I love about nature as technology, there is no tech risk, right? We know how to do this. And with regenerative agriculture, for example, in some ways it means actually using less technology or using principles to work with the land that anyone can adopt. And it is actually being rolled out in some places in India. And it can lower input costs given where oil prices are and natural gas prices are right now. It can also help just create better economic models for communities. And so I think there's probably a combination. I'm not expecting everything to happen all at once, but certainly on the nature and food and ag side of things, there's a huge amount of room for India to lead. as well as on some of these early commercial deployments that I mentioned on the tech side.
And Siddharth, do you think sort of any strategic decision making around India's R&D strategy and policy is going to facilitate some of this, efforts around climate technology and climate finance? Did you see anything or hear anything from G20 that gave you a positive feeling about what's going forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, India does have some great R&D strengths, as with the kind of moon landing recently. I think there's quite a lot that can be done when political will and the right people are put to a certain problem. I think, and this is just stepping back from just India to globally, almost every country is asking itself, how do we attract R&D funding and R&D to our economies versus have it go elsewhere? I think it does start from having, good policies and sufficient capital, but it also involves having the right skills in the right places. And I think that's where, outside of a few pockets of true excellence and global leadership, India really struggles, right? Because I think, unfortunately, the skills base for this type of work doesn't exist. And of course, we've had a ton of brain drain over the last decade, 2 decades. So I don't expect that to change overnight. And then you go one level down to, more basic skills that you will need for this workforce of the future. We just don't have it. And so I think R&D is really important. Having these kind of flagship programs is really important. But in some ways, I almost think it's more important to train the 40, 50, 60% of youth who are currently either unemployed or underemployed to enter jobs that I think will exist in this new green economy. Because back to our initial framing, right? I think that path that was available to countries in the 40s, 50s, 60s to essentially grow economically without any regard for decarbonization, that path doesn't really exist anymore, regardless of what global politics looks like. And so given there is a different path, that feels like a big opportunity to me.
I want to come back to this opportunity piece, Siddharth, because I think that's key. But you touched upon the finance piece, right? When you discuss why Sweden is able to do certain things that, let's say, a company in India is not able to do. Climate finance, as you see it, and you're working in climate venture capital as well, as am I in many ways. And the climate finance puzzle, if you look at the way G20 has been dealing with it and the way the broader framework for climate finance is going to work out, has at least a few pieces in my mind, right? There's the startup innovation venture capital piece.
Yeah.
There's the larger private equity piece. And then there's the international institutions or MDBs, multilateral development banks piece. And then one can argue that there's some amount of philanthropy or aid piece that countries might give to the other, right? If let's say these were the 4 pieces, one, I want to ask you if there are any other elements of this climate finance puzzle that we should be talking about, one. And second, talk to us about each of those 4 pieces and where we stand vis-a-vis India in particular. What are we doing well on? What are we still not getting right in getting our own climate finance strategy correct?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. Let me just run through them. So I think I spent a few weeks in India over the summer just for book stuff and also engaging with climate tech entrepreneurs and investors. There's a huge amount of activity going on. It's hugely heartening. I'm sure Anirudh, you're part of this, but I've been really heartened to see just how much activity there is with early stage companies that are being built. Many of them in deep tech, so tackling hard asset solutions as well as software solutions. And there's a huge amount of energy and enthusiasm that I think is a huge asset. The VC ecosystem in India is actually very well developed relative to where it was a decade ago. We don't yet have many climate investors. We have a few excellent ones. Many of them are good friends, but we don't yet have institutional climate investors that are raising institutional capital to certainly at the kind of venture and early growth side of things. That needs to change, I think. We need domestic sources of capital to make that work. The same, I think, applies to growth equity, where I think we do have growth equity and PE in India, but it tends to be for reasonably mature and de-risked business models. I think there's a looming issue where many of these early companies in climate tech, as they grow up, are going to find that they can't raise the capital they need because they are necessarily more capital intensive than just SaaS businesses. So I think there is that looming crunch, and we'll have to figure out what to do with that. And so that worries me a little bit. To be fair, that's true globally, but it's acutely an issue in India. I think with MDBs and kind of broader project finance for large scale infrastructure, again, with solar and wind, very clear that it's available. I don't see a huge amount of activity in industrial decarbonization yet in India, being financed by kind of large project finance sources. I think that is a problem. I'm not sure there's an easy fix to that beyond some of the other things we mentioned. But there is, I think one of the things the government has done is they're beginning to provide guarantees, subsidies, all of the policy tools that other countries have pulled to make it possible to de-risk some of these large infra deployments. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US is a great example of that, as well as the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Both those things have helped create markets for large-scale infrastructure in a way that didn't exist before. Of course, it requires incredible financial firepower that India may not have. But even changing policies to make them more supportive, streamlining permits, all of that helps. It helps attract international institutional money into the country, because India has a moment now where one of the great assets is India is not China, and that's attractive for many institutional investors. But so far, the extent to which India has capitalized on that hasn't been complete. And then philanthropy, there's great work. The Climate Collective has been doing some Climate Collaborative, I should say, is doing some really important work in bringing together Indian philanthropists for climate. It tends to be, so if we step back, I think philanthropy globally has done a huge amount of good for climate. And if you look at some of the large personal philanthropies, the Bezos Earth Funds and Gates and various others, and Rockefeller as well, so large foundation, they've done some really, really important work to help de-risk early stage climate technologies, as well as empower activists and civil society groups. And there's a huge amount that to be done. I think there's probably the same struggle that all of civil society is having in India with climate as well, where philanthropy currently doesn't have the latitude to be as active as it could be. And I think that's just true across the board. It's true with climate as well. What gives me hope is India historically has been a place where grassroots environmental movements have been incredibly active, from things like Narmada Bachao Andolan to lots of other things that have happened over the years, from the grassroots, led by people who face climate change every day. So there are, I think, strong civil society green shoots, but I think that probably is the place where there's just less happening beyond some of the efforts of individual philanthropists. The other G-20 link, Priyanka, was there was this letter from CEOs of large companies that went out about climate, which I thought was a really, really good sign, because I think it showed that Indian corporates, which is the fifth piece I'd add to your list, is corporate money is really important, both in creating new markets for goods and services and simply through their balance sheets, because they can invest in a way that institutional investors cannot. They can take risks that we can't. And so corporate money is going to be really, really important if we're going to transition these sectors and drive capital where it needs to go. And so that was hugely encouraging.
Absolutely. And that seems to be what, if you look at the conversation that Mr. Banga at the World Bank seems to be prioritizing, is this whole idea of the private sector capital piece riding on top of whatever dollar that MDBs like the World Bank give out, for that number to be at least $1 to the dollar that the World Bank puts in. But, I've heard numbers going up to $5 for each dollar, $10 to each dollar. So I agree with you that the corporate piece here will be an important piece, in addition to obviously the private equity capital that's floating around the world.
So do you see a promising future for carbon markets evolving? How is carbon trading going, and what's it looking like in India right now?
Yeah, carbon is a really interesting one. Almost every country is grappling with this. Stepping back, carbon markets can be really powerful because they drive low-cost emission reductions across the economy, if done well, if done with integrity, which is not always the case. The history, thankfully, the World Bank is a good tracker of what's going on with carbon pricing all over the world. There's regulatory markets and compliance markets. Currently in India, the conversation is muddled. So we're kind of talking about voluntary carbon credits in the same breath as we talk about emissions reductions in industry. Historically, they've been separate. And so you have emissions trading schemes, either carbon taxes or trading schemes that help drive down emissions from industrial sources like power plants and in industry. And then you have voluntary sources of carbon credits for good stuff on the ground, like reforestation with native species, or clean cookstove projects, or landfill gas capture and things like that. I think there is a risk that we focus too much on the second, on the voluntary side, without first understanding the carbon pricing. It can be a really powerful tool for decarbonization if and only if carbon prices are high enough. So if you look at the experience of carbon markets, regulated carbon markets across the world, the ones that have really worked, like the EU's emissions trading scheme or California's cap and trade system, the price has been high enough to actually drive decarbonization. And so that does impose a cost, but the revenue can be recycled. So, in theory, you could use that money to fund the green transition, or you could apply tax and do exactly the same thing with the revenue. But that feels to me like a really, really important thing for India to work on. Except for New Zealand, no country has put agriculture within an emissions trading scheme. I think with India, given how big the agriculture base is, but balancing that against the fact that you don't want to unduly burden farmers who are already struggling, there has to be some solution, right? It may not be capping agricultural emissions. It may be an incentive scheme like the UK's tried. But I feel like some combination of national, either cap and trade or carbon tax, and then incentives for the land use sector to change are fundamentally important. And then the voluntary side, I think it's important to clarify regulations. Voluntary carbon markets can be really valuable, but I feel like they will be a small part of the answer. And the bigger part of the answer is getting regulated carbon markets working in the main sectors of the economy that cause the majority of emissions.
If I may, I want to dig deeper into this agriculture piece, right, that you've now referred to in the case of India a couple of times. And of course, there's a big chunk of the nature argument that you've made in your book. Let's go deeper into that piece. What are the specific things that you think India could do on the agriculture, land use piece that you were referring to, incentives for farmers? I'm assuming you're familiar with the kind of socio-political environment that today agricultural policy in India is made within. And given that also, what are some of the specific policy initiatives you think could be put in place to both make the case for nature in the agriculture sector, but also incentivize behavioral change in farming practices?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky thing because across the world, agriculture means communities, and behavior change is always hard.
Yeah.
This flag up front is agriculture in India is hugely subsidized. Everything in agriculture is subsidized. So we currently spend huge amounts of money, I don't have the exact figure to hand, on things like fertilizer subsidies so farmers can buy enough fertilizer to fertilize their soils, on the fact that water is effectively free to farmers, and or even for large users, very cheap, below the cost that it should be to drive behavior change. And so when we have a policy environment, like in most of the world, to be fair, where harmful subsidies help drive a certain system, you can't blame individual farmers for acting on the basis of the information they're given and the incentives they're given. So I don't blame individuals at all. I actually think the system is tilted towards highly industrialized agriculture that is incredibly extractive, that uses a lot of inputs, and that frankly has been really good at feeding a large and growing population from being food insecure to actually producing more than enough food to feed 1.4 billion people. That's a good thing. But I think you're seeing, certainly in our most important agricultural regions, signs that this system is creaking, right? You see the fact that there is no longer enough water to reliably harvest the crops we need. And that, we're so dependent on the monsoon system, which is expected to weaken and change over time in ways that will be unhelpful to agriculture. The fact that soil in India is among the most depleted or anywhere on earth. There's basically no agriculture system anywhere on earth, except maybe parts of Brazil, where the soil is as depleted because of the fact that we ended up with this kind of system. So those are specific areas where I think small policy changes can have a big difference. Right?
Like what? Like what kind of policy changes?
So fertilizers, for example, right? We currently subsidize chemical fertilizer.
Yes.
Why is it simple? It's fossil-based. We know who sells it. It's subsidized with an input price subsidy, right? If you made that, so it could be agnostic to the type of fertilizer and actually incentivized, bio-based inputs, for example. That alone would change purchasing decisions across the country. But currently, we don't do that. Currently, we're
biofertilizers enough to replace a large chunk of the chemical fertilizer use, and are they cheap enough today?
Yeah, I'm throughout the book, I kind of get away from the silver bullet solution. So it's not like you spray this microbe and you don't need to use any input, so we magically go organic across the country at once. But there are big changes you can make that dramatically cut inputs. They don't eliminate them, but that's fine. So I can give you real examples. A generation we've invested in a company called Pivot Bio in the US. They coat seeds with a microbe that fixes nitrogen in the soil. That cuts fertilizer use by a big chunk, about a third, and even higher in some cases. And they've now been sprayed on 10%, not sprayed, it's being used on 10% of corn acres in the US. It's a huge amount of land. And why? Because it's actually cheaper. And so you both save input costs, so you're saving your fertilizer cost, you're regenerating soil health because the soil is now, it has a better soil microbiome than it had before. And farmers are happy, producers are really, really happy. So there are specific products that actually make complete sense. And often they're used in combination with fossil-based inputs. That's fine for now, but that would be a very specific change. I think that's important. The second, I think, would be, and some countries have had a really tough experience of this, but we have to start pricing our water resources fairly. This is really basic, but obviously it's really politically hard to say, farmers, you don't get free water anymore. But unfortunately, if we do this, there will not be enough water in 10 or 20 years to feed anyone, right? And so the countries that have done it, no, this is not popular anywhere in the world. And you look at it and you say, really, is that going to happen in India? Maybe not. But the reality of the fact that there isn't enough is really hitting home. And individual farmers are really angry. And the places where it's been done well, the argument is made that this is about making sure that you have enough to actually get your harvest, rather than being at the kind of whims and mercies of the rains or allocations this year. I think is really important. So if we don't price water fairly, and we can absolutely support the smallest producers so they can continue producing, but the market price is too low and it incentivizes over extraction, we have to fix that. Lots of other countries have gone through that really difficult period and have come out on the other side and said, actually, it can work. And it can work quite well for individual producers. Because, for example, the fact that we flood irrigate rice in India today, I think in a changing climate is not going to be possible, except in a few places where it naturally rains a lot. And if we accept that and say we will have to shift to other crops that are more or less water intensive, it means you can continue to produce and get your income, or you just use the resources in a change. You have to keep emphasizing this, in a changing climate. India is a tropical and subtropical region that is becoming increasingly arid. We have to face up to that fact.
Yeah.
Siddharth, we have 10 minutes. I want to get to a little bit of reading from your book. And also, I thought, it would be nice for you to walk us through some inspiring examples, India focus across the state or local civil society, or even just any inspiring examples you see of entrepreneurs in India working on carbon tech or carbon removal that we could read about or look into post-talk. Would be wonderful to hear from you.
Very good. So let me read a very small section from the beginning of my book. So this is actually how the book opens. And it really captures, it was a moment where it came to life for me, and I put it straight in the introduction. So I'll read from it. To our right, just across the Monsoonal River, lay a forest of sorrel trees, the constant hum of cicadas in the undergrowth, punctuated only by the call of an Indian cuckoo. Just minutes from where we now stood, we sighted the area's dominant male tiger, Nila Nala, marking his territory as he strutted across the clearing, cheetal deer scattering in his wake. On the near side of the river was a different landscape altogether. Field after field of paddy, dotted with the colorful mud and terracotta houses typical of the Gond and Bega tribal communities. The tractors and shiny motorcycles parked around the place represented the recent, if still modest, prosperity of much of rural India. A few decades ago, the two vistas may have been indistinguishable. In 2022, the difference was night and day. The core zone of the celebrated Kanha National Park across the river had remained largely pristine, supporting a rebound in tiger populations as poaching pressures within the park eased. The challenge lay in the so-called buffer zone to our left. The legacy of relocations of tribal villages out of the park, combined with India's recent economic growth, had seen rice paddies and roads displace what had once been a thickly forested corridor to tiger reserves further afield. A previously vast, interconnected natural ecosystem across the central Indian highlands was becoming little more than a set of scattered wildlife refuges in a landscape increasingly defined by human influence. I think this is how it starts, and I think it kind of, for me, frames the challenge of we've done a good job protecting core natural areas. We've done a frankly terrible job of protecting the rest. And this book is really about the rest. It's about what we do in those places where humans and nature need to coexist and can find productive ways of doing so. And in terms of examples, as you asked me with India, lots of examples. I mean, I don't want to single out individuals and say these are the ones you should go and look up. But I think there are lots and lots of examples in the startup world of people who are building, and give you the flavor of what's going on. I mean, we're seeing business models around much better carbon markets with high integrity in India. We're seeing things like new battery chemistries being developed in India and battery manufacturing. Within the nature space, we're seeing a number of models that are scaling up things like agroforestry and commercializing tree species like Pongamia, which is native to India, for things like biofuel and animal feed, while also regenerating the soil. We're seeing a number of models doing things like biochar and bio-based agricultural inputs. We're seeing alternatives to rice paddy cultivation that are more efficient. We're seeing the use of nature to replace synthetic packaging and materials in the wider economy. There's a huge amount being developed in India. I think it's fantastic. And we've got some great early stage investors helping support these ideas. If anyone wants to get in touch with me, I'm very happy to offer pointers and point you in the right direction if it's helpful.
Any particular states in India that stand out for you when you were writing this book in terms of your research that are doing some noteworthy work in terms of large-scale policy or programmatic efforts?
I mean, there's been nearly every state has some bright spot. And so I tried to pick out some of the bright spots. For example, in Punjab and Haryana, there's this Happy Seeder program that's helping do direct seeding of rice. That's the methane, but also reduce crop residues and burning, because you don't have to burn the stubble anymore. You can directly seed. And so both those states are doing a good job of rolling that out. There's a huge amount, I think, historically that's happened in the southern states of Karnataka, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, in terms of just conservation and protecting of natural habitats. Andhra has done a really good job with regen ag, so just reducing the use of inputs, using farmer cooperatives to try and improve agricultural practices and disseminate information, and do things like coffee agroforestry along the way. So there's quite a lot going on. There's really examples everywhere. Obviously, there's a huge amount of tech startup energy in places like Bangalore and Mumbai. Mm-hmm. There's really something for everyone. So wherever you look, there's some good stuff going on. But of course, there's challenges everywhere.
How does this compare, Siddharth, to other countries that are both on the developed side, let's say the US, UK, Europe, but also the other developing countries like Indonesia, where you've spent some time? How does the Indian climate innovation system on the ground today benchmark, if you were to benchmark it, where does it stand vis-a-vis both the developed and the developing countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the sheer number of startups, that number has grown rapidly, I think, over the last 12 to 24 months. And so I'm seeing lots of climate investors globally look at India and say there's a huge amount going on. So in terms of benchmarking, India is seen as one of those developing countries with a huge amount of startup energy in the climate space. I think that's even vis-a-vis Indonesia and lots of other Asian countries. And that's a really good thing. I've seen lots of deal flow from Indian companies across our desks here in London, which I think is a really good thing. Relative to the US and Europe, I think there's still a way to go, particularly because of that capital gap I mentioned. There still aren't enough deep-pocketed institutional investors in India who can help support these companies, and so they remain reliant on funding from abroad. And that obviously comes with certain expectations of returns and certain expectations on scale. And frankly, there are lots of investors, particularly on the project finance side, who've made a lot of money investing in solar and wind in India, but plenty who've been burnt through lots of experiences of regulatory changes, and there's lots of concerns. And so I think if I were to summarize, I think India is seen as a top destination to look at. We're not seeing significant money flow yet into the climate tech ecosystem, just because there's still that perception of risk, and these companies tend to be quite early. But as they grow up, I think this is changing as we speak. So I don't want to give you a definitive answer, but relative to most of Southeast Asia, even, there's a huge amount going
on. We didn't talk about the media. I mean, I definitely want to make sure we cover them as a stakeholder as well. Siddharth, do you see anything changing in the conversation by media in India around climate change, local solutions, R&D policy? Any inspiring examples? I mean, you said you've been around for a decade now, and your work has taken you in and out of India. So how do you think that conversation is changing?
I mean, as we all know, I think Indian media is going through a very tough period right now, and it's not easy in the current environment to be too strident. I think if I were to compare, and I'm trying to put this in a way that is truly balanced, I think in other places, media outlets have done a really good job of putting real pressure on corporate leaders and political leaders to change and act. And that is, for me, the most fundamental role of the media. And you've seen that, even in the US, with a huge amount of public pressure that media across different, both print and TV, have put on leaders following a string of natural disasters just this year, right? And that's really helped bring climate change to life for a lot of people and forced leaders to act and change. I don't think we have that environment right now. And so I think there's plenty of good work being done, highlighting case studies and success stories and so on. But for me, back to why media is really important, I think it is about holding leaders to account, because pledges are all well and good. Implementation is ultimately what matters. And I think civil society and the media, that is the role they need to play, in addition to being rightly celebrating good work.
Yeah.
We're out of time, but Siddharth, I thought, I saw that you dedicated this book to your father and your grandparents, right? From what I've seen. So I just thought you would end with something personal about your life. I know you've been born and raised in India, is that right? So you've spent some time there. Tell us about just, your personal journey to how you connected with this topic. Any observations growing up, your experiences? Would love to end on a personal note about your just personal journey.
Yeah, I mean, my grandma was wonderful. She was a massive animal lover and nature lover, and spent a lot of her career working on this topic directly. Her dad, my great granddad, he was a conservation biologist as well.
Okay.
Actually studied at Oxford on the same program. Back in the day on a scholarship, really random story. But then he ended up back in India working in the Forest Service, setting up and running national parks. And so that there's a kind of personal link to some of the challenges we're seeing now, because I believe he was involved in setting up many of these national parks, including Kana. And obviously that there's been a legacy of that. That wasn't a clear win, right? That came with fairly violent exclusion of indigenous people from these areas. Came with massive challenges. But it's also left a legacy of deep conservation within this amazing place where you have so many people coexisting with some of the richest flora and fauna on Earth. And so there is a personal link to this entire story, and I've kind of cared about nature from the very beginning. Even in my lifetime, I've seen Indian nature change a huge amount, because that I've kind of lived through. My life is basically the post-liberalization years of India, and so that's been it. And I've seen that journey, and I've seen what a toll it's taken on our natural landscapes. And so I grew up in Chennai, where my school was actually in a small fragment of forest in the middle of the city, and that remains. But Chennai as a city is now, I think, well over 10 million people, and has lost a huge amount of green cover, as Bangalore has done. I spent a lot of time in Bangalore as well. And that's come because of economic growth and development. And so there's the kind of strong personal links to both from family history as well as seeing India change significantly just in my lifetime. Then just imagining what it would have been like 100 years ago when my great granddad was working on these problems. So that's kind of why I remain quite connected to it.
That's right. I think that gives us all the drive to work on this piece, because I think much like you, anyone living in India now, at whatever age they might be, can now relate to many of the examples that I think you've shared. But, I spent some time in the Himalayas, favorite time. You're seeing the last few months, Himachal and Uttarakhand have really suffered from some of the worst natural disasters they've seen. So I think whether it's the north, the south, west, east, center, I think India is facing the brunt of climate change in many unexpected ways often also. It's not just the coastal areas that people used to think will get affected, which is why I think it speaks to the importance of the work you're doing, the importance of the book you've written. So thank you today for taking the time. Thank you for writing the book, and hope we can continue to stay engaged.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Siddharth. We're proud of you as a fellow Kennedy School alum, and thanks for your time today.
All right, kind. Thank you.